Continuing our look at Photino under the covers, and this video is going to cover the Photino samples. So if you go to github.com, try Photino, photino.samples, you can just download these as a zip file, or you can clone the repo to get a copy of them. That's the easiest way to see how Photino works and to get started on a new project. So here you can see I've got all the Photino samples, and we're going to start off with the easiest one, hellophotino.net. And this is just a very basic sample. If we look at the program file, you can see that it just does things like set a window title and set the size of the window, and it registers a couple of handlers so that when things happen in the JavaScript, we can respond to them. It tells it to load up www.rootindex.html, just this file right here. And if we look at the properties on that, it's just set to copy to the output folder so that it's available as a loose file when this runs. And then we tell it to wait for close. So if I run this app, you're going to see the basic window come up, and there's our dynamically inserted JavaScript. That's this registered custom scheme handler, and you can see that it's got a custom scheme of app. So when it sees something like app : / it's going to run this code in response to that. If we look at our index.html, you can see that we actually do call app dynamic JavaScript, and we're telling it whenever you see that, this is how we want to handle it. So very basic example there. And then we're registering a handler so that when the button is clicked on the screen, we're having it send a message back to us. So this is coming from the JavaScript, and we're just taking the string that they send us, tacking on the word receive message, and then sending it right back into the JavaScript. So back into the HTML page, and it comes up in an alert window. And we can see that alert window is right here. So we're setting up a handler that says when a message is received, this is the code I want to run. In this case, it's just show it in an alert box. So that's the very simplest sample we have. Now, something that's useful is to go into the properties for this and change the output type from a Windows application to a console application. Now, when I do this and run it again, you'll see that the console window actually comes up, and I can use that. I find it's very helpful for debugging. So that's how I toggle that on and off. Now, if you want to see what's actually going on under the hood, we can edit the project file, and it's just changing the output type here. So it's changing it from a console application, just an exe, to a Windows application. It's a WinExe. So examining and running the different samples is a great way to learn how Photino works and some of the things you can do with it. There's some examples in here. For example, if we set this as the startup project, Hello Photino 3D, that just shows a 3D Pong game. So this is just showing that the browser control can do some relatively advanced things. We also have examples of popular frameworks like React and Angular. So if I set this as the startup project, you can see a real Angular app working. I just have the console window turned off. So this is an example of an Angular app that's actually calling out to our Git repo and returning some information. Now, the Angular, React, and Vue samples all use a static file server, and we found this to be a great way to build more advanced applications. If we take a look at this sample, we can see that it's very similar to the hellophotino.net sample that we had. There's just a www root with an index.html page, and that's what shows up when we run it. You may notice that running the web server on the client makes things quite a bit slower, and what we found is that this is really a product of the debugger. So in this case, we're showing the console window, we're showing all the debugging, and it does seem to be quite slow. In practice, we found very little difference as far as performance, memory usage, etc. when we have the web server running. So here we have a very similar application to what we had shown in the simple app, and it's got the same functionality, but you'll notice that the web server is running in the background. So this is an entire ASP.NET web server, and it's remarkably efficient. And the plus side of running a full web server is that it makes some things quite a bit easier, especially in the more advanced applications. So we add photino.net.server to add this functionality, and it makes use of the file providers. So that gives us a couple of capabilities. One is, like we had done before, we can have a www root folder with an index.html file, and this is just a loose file that gets copied and it's served up by the web server. But this embedded provider allows us to embed files in the compiled application and serve them from there instead of from the file system. And the way we do that is in this resource folder. We have a www root folder here as well. I can, for example, copy this file and paste a copy of it into the resources folder. Now I'm going to change this so that we can tell the difference between the two. Now I'm going to check the properties for that file, and I'm going to set this as an embedded resource. So it's going to be compiled into the solution. Now I'll run this again. And you'll see that we're getting the embedded resources version of that index.html file. The way it's currently set up, we prefer embedded resources over loose files, and that's a security issue. Somebody can't just drop a loose file in there and have it override something that's embedded in your application. Now that's something you can change manually, and at some point we'd like to give you the option of configuring that. So we found that using the static file server, like is used in the Angular and React and Vue applications and samples, we have an easier time developing these applications. It handles such things as problems with CORS issues. So CORS, if you're not familiar, is a cross-site scripting issue. If you have files loaded from your local hard drive, it expects all the files to be loaded from that local hard drive, from that specific URL. So we found that using the static file server is a great way around some of the issues we run into with more advanced applications. This can be an issue if you're loading files from one place and calling, for example, a web API from another. It thinks that they're coming from two different locations and it doesn't trust them. It can also be a problem loading modules. So if you use something like Webpack to pack up your application and then you try and load a module, you'll find that it just may not work if you're loading it from a local file system. So running things through this file server allows us to load things off of disk. It allows us to load things off of embedded resources, and allows us to host things like Web API all in one shot. Prior to that, we had this gRPC sample, and this essentially uses Web API, and on top of Web API, we went ahead and added gRPC, which is a binary protocol for remote calls that was invented by Google. With that, we had to do some things like add CORS policies to tell it that all of the calls into the API were actually safe calls. So we're telling it that even though we loaded the initial page from a local disk and we're loading this from an HTTP address, these are all going to be considered safe. So this was just an advanced example of using Web API, and we're running gRPC on top of that Web API. So going forward, we recommend using the static file server approach unless it's just a very simple application you're building. So the way you do that is use this Photino server class, and we've got a couple of static methods on there. Create static file server returns to you the base URL. So it's going to find an available port that you can use to host everything locally, and it's going to return that to you so that you know what the port is. Now the next thing we do is create our Photino window, and you're going to notice here at the bottom that when we're loading up our page, we're actually going to load it from the base URL. So that's going to be something like http localhost :8080, for example, /index.html. And the server is going to read that file off of disk. And just to show you there's very little performance and resource difference between running the full web server and not running the web server on the client, we're going to go ahead and run this. Now, this is without the debugger, and you'll see that it loads pretty much instantly. So the overhead that you sometimes see when running in Visual Studio is really just the debugger slowing things down. It's not that this is using a lot of extra resources or that the performance is not good. Now, one of my favorite samples is the test bench. We use this sample a lot during development, and it shows off a lot of the features that are available. You can see in the console window behind me that I'm logging all of the events that are happening. So as I move and resize the window, I'm responding to those things and showing them on screen. I can show zooming in, I can show zooming out, I can move the window to the center. So these are all things that I'm doing programmatically. Taking pictures is something we've only gotten to work so far on Windows and the WebView 2 control. The other browsers aren't supporting it yet. I can minimize my window, maximize my window. By default, I have this context menu, but I can turn that context menu off. Now, when I do that, I do have to reload the page. If I turn it back on again, I can see that I can just turn off the developer tools. So now I have the context window, but I can't get into developer tools. I can't inspect, for example. I can change the icon on my window. I can change the position of the window. Here I'm just moving the window a couple of pixels down and to the right each time. I can tell the window that it's no longer resizable. And now resizing is back again. I can increase the size of the window, decrease it. I can change the title of the window. You can see an asterisk being added each time I click that. I can make it a topmost window so it doesn't go behind other windows. So if I turn on topmost, I now no longer can bring another window in front of it. I can put it into kiosk mode. That's where there's no Chrome whatsoever. You notice the start bar is gone. I can show some state information. I can send web messages, and I can even send toast notifications. It's an interesting sample to look at to see how some of these things are done. If we look in the constructor, we can see that there's code for fluent style or property initialization style. So fluent style is what you see in most of the other examples where we call these fluent methods to do things like set the chromeless or set the zoom. Property init style is a little more old school where we're just setting the properties directly when we create the window, and then we're calling register our scheme handler and calling wait for close. So you can mess around with all the different settings in this example. For example, if I want to set up the window to be chromeless when it fires up, I now have no title bar or sizing bars on any of the window. In many Electron apps, you'll see this style used where there's no Chrome on the window, and they use JavaScript and HTML to build all of that so that they have full control over it. They can make the window look however they like. Down below, you'll see some of the events that I've hooked up, and all I'm doing here is just logging, in this case, logging to that console window. So the samples are a great way to get started on a new app, and they're a great way to learn about Photino. In order to make using the samples a little bit easier, we've created an extension for Visual Studio. If I browse the Visual Studio Marketplace and look for Photino, I can see that I've got project templates available. I'm going to go ahead and restart Visual Studio so these become available to me. If I was to create a new project, I could search for and use all of these project templates. So for example, if I pick the static file server, all this project template is really going to do is create the sample just like we saw before. And if I go ahead and run that sample, I'll get everything that we saw last time. It's just a handy way to start a new Photino project. If you're a user of Visual Studio Code, you start new projects with .NET New. And if you do /L, you'll see a list of all the project templates that are loaded on your machine. Now, I've just got standard project templates, but I can add the Photino project templates because they're packaged up as NuGet packages. So same thing that you get if you install a Visual Studio extension, just a different way of getting them. .NET New -I for install. Try photino.vscode.project.templates. And now if I list my templates again, I'll see that these are available. So for example, I could create a new folder. And say .NET New Photino static file server, and it's going to create that project for me. Now let me go ahead and open that folder. And you'll see that I have everything that I need to run the application. And if I want to run it with the console window, I'm just going to change this output type from WinExe to EXE and run again. And now you can see the console running below.